acclaimed British author, film critic, Hispanist, and he's actually a very well-known researcher on autism as well. And I think even at some point you were a conference interpreter as well, right? It's a completely different facet.
You're better at that than me.
Well, but still, yes, he's a very versatile researcher and, well, I think writer himself. Our club has a quirky name, Anglo-Russian, but at the same time, we are very much interested. What makes us different from English clubs and Russian clubs, besides probably the dress etiquette, is that we are trying not really, I mean, we would love to introduce Russian films and artists and critics, but at the same time, we are not so much interested in informing you. I think we are very much interested in, we're trying to emphasize the connection between different cultures and sometimes misconceptions, misunderstandings, and everything that happens in between in this hyphenated area. So I think ultimately we really want to exchange our different points of view. So one of the big parts, so we have a whole series, I think, Russia through the eyes of the other. So we are trying to see how Russia is viewed by other poets and critics and researchers, and at the same time we are also trying to explore those visible and sometimes obvious, I mean sometimes invisible connections. You probably know that Pablo Neruda had all his sympathies, I mean his Soviet and pro-communist sympathies are very well known, and you may know that he was a Nobel Prize laureate. Probably few of you know that he also won the Stalin Prize in 1953, but I have just recently discovered one more, much earlier connection, not just with the Soviet Union, because Adam will tell us a lot more about it, but and with the Russian culture, was actually that Pablo Neruda, which is obviously his pseudonym, is not the first one. So the much earlier one dates back all the way to his childhood, when he used to sign his first poems as Sashka Zhigulov, if I'm not mistaken, which was based on novella by Leonid Andreev, because as a young boy he was so impressed by the Russian literature, and most importantly by this Robin Hood-like character who was the son of the general and who decided to save the poor. And both the writer Leonid Andreev and well, the author who was to become Pablo Neruda was so inspired that he decided to sign his poems Sashka Zhigulov. I hope that's a convincing connection. But then obviously the surname was not really pronounceable for Spanish speakers, so I think he had to give it up for Pablo Neruda. And on this note, I think that Adam will be, you're in much better hands. We'll talk a lot more about, well, Pablo Neruda and the Soviet Union.
Thank you so much. Well, welcome everybody to this talk. I'm going to just whisk you through the extraordinary relationship between Pablo Neruda and the former Soviet Union. Neruda was a Chilean poet, born in 1904, and I'm not going to tell you much about his life. You can read it in my biography, which I have a couple of copies willing to sign. And he got the Nobel Prize in 1971 for literature and died in 1973. I'll talk a bit about his death towards the end, because some of you may have read in The Guardian, because I wrote the piece, about the fact that they've officially ruled that he didn't die of cancer. That's the official verdict, was that he died on September 23rd, 1973, 12 days after the Pinochet coup, of cancer. And now the forensics scientists who have been examining Neruda's bones, remains, because he was exhumed, this great poet, who was called the greatest poet of the 20th century in any language by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He was dug up, to put an unfriendly expression, in April 2013, and they kept him above ground for 3 years to see whether his chauffeur, Manuel Araya, was right in his claiming that Neruda was poisoned in the hospital in Santa Maria Clinic in Santiago, the capital, and was poisoned rather than to accelerate his death. That's the situation as it is. The forensics came back just last week and said we found some strange bacteria in the remains. We don't know what they are, but we're going to look at them, and we are going to investigate. 6 months to a year, we'll come back with a definitive version of whether the one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, was killed. You know, this extraordinary story. Neruda loved detective novels. He was reading a Maigret Simon when he heard that he got the Nobel Prize. If he hadn't been the centre of the whole story, he would have loved that. But anyway, I'm not going to give you more on that. I am going to now my PowerPoint. Just a quick technical point. That my PowerPoint is on a PC. This is a Mac system, so it's not absolutely 100% compatible. It's as near as we can get. So here we go. So anyway, Neruda's first contact with the Soviet Union was through its literature, because he was born in Parral in central Chile. That's the Maule region where all the best wine in the world comes from. Neruda felt that because wherever he was in the world, he always asked for Chilean wine. Even in Singapore, in the most ridiculous places, he said he agreed with me and other people. It was the best wine, and it was made in Parral. But he moved when he was 2 to Temuco in the south of Chile, and that was this. His childhood was kind of marked by rain falling on the wooden roofs. He wrote some wonderful poems about that, and he then started writing poetry. His father didn't want him to be a poet. His father was a train driver. That's a huge irony. His father, José de Carmen, was a severe man. He thought poetry was not a macho occupation, and his son, who was called Neftali Reyes, his real name, should be doing something more worthwhile than writing poetry. In fact, his father dashed up to his son's room and chucked all the notebooks out of the window that he was writing poetry. And so Neruda secretly wrote a lot of his poetry. He then took some of his poetry to a woman, the woman who was the head of the girls' school in Temuco, who was a woman called Lucila Godoy, Chilean woman, who was better known as Gabriela Mistral. Gabriela Mistral, if anyone knows that name, I think some of you will, was the first woman ever to win a Nobel Prize, and she was the first Latin American to win a Nobel Prize for Literature. She won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1945. She hadn't won it, of course she wasn't then, it was back, we're talking about 1918, 1919, when Neruda went to this girl. He showed his poems to Gabriela Mistral, and she said, they're not bad, but you need to read more. And you need to read more Russian literature. Above all, he said, Dostoevsky, read Tolstoy, read Dostoevsky, read the great Russian, and Neruda did. He took notice of that, started reading, and he never forgot that piece of advice. He was absolutely enamoured of those great classics, and this is another poet he came to, Vladimir Mayakovsky, one of the great poets of the 20th century again, Russian poet, who killed himself in 1930. I'm going to read you just a very short extract from all these hundreds of books that Neruda wrote. Something to point out about Neruda, he was a great poet, but he also wrote wonderful prose. People don't realise that. His memoirs are translated by Souvenir Press here in English, and they're terrific, life-affirming. He knew everybody. He was a wonderful man of action, as well as words, so they're well worth reading, they're wonderful. And he wrote this book called Passions and Impressions. It was actually a posthumous book, Passions and Impressions, para un nacido, in Spanish, and he has a little bit about Mayakovsky in here, an essay. I'll read just a tiny bit. It's an essay called Our Great Brother Mayakovsky. He says, though it's difficult to speak about Mayakovsky without becoming involved in a debate, and though this great poet soars through them like an eagle in the sky, gliding perhaps on the flight of his fancy, I want to speak about Mayakovsky with love and simplicity, without dwelling either on his productive life or on his unfortunate death. Mayakovsky is the first poet to have incorporated the party and the active proletariat into his poetry, to make great poetry from them. This is a transcendental revolution, and on the plane of universal literature, it's a contribution to contemporary poetry equal to that of Baudelaire or Whitman. Now that, coming from Neruda, was a huge praise. Baudelaire, Neruda absolutely adored. When he was Chilean ambassador in Paris in 1971, he had a meeting with President Georges Pompidou. They were supposed to discuss the Chile's foreign debt, but Carlos Fuentes, the Mexican novelist, told me that they spent 2 hours discussing Baudelaire. They didn't even talk about politics or economics. So it was a wonderful meeting. And Whitman was another hero of Neruda's. His carpenter in Chile, at his house in Isla Negra on the Pacific coast, Rafita, told me that once that he was doing some work around the house. Rafita, he came across this portrait of Whitman, and he said to Neruda, "Is that your grandfather?" Neruda said, "Yes, it is." That's how much he meant. He felt Whitman was part of the family, part of his family. So if Neruda compares Mayakovsky to both Baudelaire and Whitman, that's high praise indeed. Now, in turn, Soviet readers, they first got to read Neruda's words in the 1930s. The first thing they've ever read was actually prose again. The moving speech that Neruda delivered in Paris called "We Will Never Forget the Murder of Federico Garcia Lorca," after his great friend, Spanish poet Lorca, was killed by the fascists in Grenada in August 1937. That same year, 1937, the same journal, and you have to forgive my Russian pronunciation here, Internationalная Literatura, anyway, it's as close as you're going to get, published Neruda, I've got a thumbs up, published Neruda's address to the celebrated Second Congress of Anti-Fascist Writers. That was an extraordinary congress where some of the greatest writers of the 20th century were attended, and I'm actually going over to Valencia a couple of weeks' time to celebrate the 80th anniversary. We're going to have a congress in Valencia to mark the 80th anniversary of that congress where Neruda, Octavio Paz, César Vallejo, writers from all countries got together and condemned the fascists for stifling freedom of expression. In 1938, the first Russian translators of Neruda's poetry began to appear in the USSR, namely Fyodor Kielin's versions of "Let Me Explain a Few Things," which is Neruda's great poem from Spain in My Heart, where he explains why his poetry had moved from anguished internal looking to outward poetry for social and political justice. Great poem. I read it on your radio.
Yes,
Carolina's Venezuelan radio station just the other day. Now, Neruda's great Russian friend Ilya Ehrenburg, and I'll come back to him in a minute, did much to popularise Neruda's work. In fact, Neruda gave him a copy of Spain in My Heart in Madrid, and Ehrenburg immediately began to translate it into Russian. Ehrenburg was, in case you don't know, he was the correspondent for Izvestia in Spain. So here, for your interest, is the beginning of Explico algunas cosas. Let me explain a few things in Spanish, and look at that, I've got the Russian for you. This is Ehrenburg's translation of the beginning of Neruda's poem, Explico algunas cosas. Let me explain a few things. In English it means you would ask, where are the lilacs? The metaphysics covered in poppies, and the rain beat his words, filling them with holes and birds. I'll tell you everything that's happened to me. It's a wonderful poem. I haven't got time to read it now, but there we are. So just a little bit of Russian. How many people speak Russian here? Obviously. So we've got 2 or 3, maybe 5. There we go. I don't know how good the translation is.
That's really decent. Yeah.
Is it pretty okay?
Yeah,
Is it okay?
very yes.
Right. Good. Other Russian translations of Neruda began to appear over the next few decades by Ovadia Savich, Simeon Kisarov, and I'll come back to him again in a minute, Lev Ospovat and Vera Kutishkova, again I'll mention them, among many others, Grushko, quite a few others. There were lots of Russian. In fact, by 1950, more than 250,000 of his books of poetry, 250,000, had already been sold in the Soviet Union. Of course, it's a huge country, the Soviet Union, but that's still a huge number. Furthermore, they were translated into several languages, of course, of the former Soviet republics, notably not obviously Russian, but Armenian and Ukrainian as well. As for Neruda himself, he was serving as Chilean consul in Mexico City in 1941 when he learned of the Nazi siege of Leningrad. And he was hugely impressed by the gallant Soviet resistance, and in a text discovered just a few years ago, he wrote a prose text in 1941, overtly comparing the Russian resistance to Nazism to the Republican resistance to Franco's fascist brutality in Spain, which of course he witnessed as Chilean consul in Madrid in the 1930s. On September 30th, 1942, the Mexican USSR Friendship Association, together with the Mexican Electricians Union, organised a meeting in Mexico City at which Neruda read his new poem, Love Song to Stalingrad. The poem was then plastered all over the walls of Mexico City. Can you imagine that? That's a weird idea. I mean, can you imagine London having poetry? They do, of course. You have the equivalent is poems on the tube, on the underground, which is similar. But here's an extract from that poem, Love Song to Stalingrad. City, city of fire, resist until the day we arrive. Shipwrecked Indians to caress your walls, to kiss you like the children you're waiting to greet. Stalingrad, there's no second front yet, but you'll never fall, even though iron and flames are gnawing at you day and night. It's not great poetry, but let's face it, he was a wonderful poet. This is not the best of Neruda you're getting here. But again, it came from the soul, and he genuinely believed it. Now, you can imagine this public display of poetic support came in for harsh criticisms from some quarters. The Mexican daily, called Novedades, declared that the streets of the capital were no place for any poetry at all, let alone political poetry. Undaunted, and he was a stubborn bugger, he really was, Neruda. He really didn't, if people told him not to do something, he was a bit like a kid. He just went on and did it even more. He was un gran niño. His friends, when I was writing my biography, said, you know, the word they use in Spanish, un gran niño. He was a big child all his life, and part of it was this stubbornness and to press ahead. He had these wonderful. He saw an object in a shop and he insisted on having it or buying it. I mean, totally unsuitable. There was like a big wooden horse. How he was going to get it back, but he got it. A globe. There was a globe in Paris. He just said, I must have that. I must have it, even though it cost thousands of whatever, or francs, the old francs, yeah. Just extraordinary. He didn't, it was a passion for him. And anyone who's been to his 3 houses, and of course, like any good communist, he had 3 houses. And they're wonderful houses in Chile. He actually had 4 because he bought a house in Normandy with the winnings from the Nobel Prize. But anyone who's been to Chile will know the one on the Pacific where he was buried and exhumed in 2013, Isla Negra, beautiful house. The Tascona, which is in Santiago, the capital, which is the headquarters of the Neruda Foundation. That's notable probably mainly for a Diego Rivera portrait of his 3rd wife, Neruda's 3rd wife, Matilde, with a profile of Neruda in her tangled hair. And then I think the most beautiful of the 3 houses, La Sebastiana in Valparaiso, which is beautiful, overlooking the bay. And so, I can't remember why I mentioned his houses now, but so what a wonderful communist he was. This is, as I said, this is pamphleteering verse. So let me read a less polemical, more lyrical, much later Neruda. This is more typical of Neruda. This is the Oda a Leningrad, the Ode to Leningrad, from the. Yeah, so this is a wonderful book of the odes. He wrote hundreds of odes through his life, Neruda. Ode to the tomato. Ode to ordinary objects. He made the ordinary extraordinary, and extraordinary ordinary, people have said, just like his good friend Picasso did. So he ode to an onion, ode to an artichoke, ode to my socks. Wonderful. Ode to my suit. And hundreds. Some of them were political, but mostly weren't. So here is Ode to Leningrad. Soft is your pristine stone, wide your white sky, beautiful grey rose, spacious Leningrad. With what tranquility I set my shoes on your ancient land. They came from another land, from virginal America. My feet had stepped over elevated wells of mud, unspeakable fragrances in the grand cordillera of my country. My shoes had touched another snow, the gusts of the wiry Andes. And now, Leningrad, your snow, your illustrious white shadows, the river with its steps submerged in white current, light like a peach branch, granting you whiteness. O ship, white ship, sailing in winter. How many things they did live through. They moved with me when I wandered amid your strings and your stone sails. When I stepped on the streets, I knew from books I became saturated with the essence of fog and seas. The young Pushkin held me by the hand with his gloved hand, and in solemn edifications of the past, in the hives of our life, my American heart entered, beating with respect and happiness, hearing the echoes of my steps as if they awakened lives, dormant while wrapped in snow, and suddenly came in to walk with me. Stepping forcefully on silence, as if on a ship's planks. How many ancient nights at a distance, my book, the rain from the island sky in marine Chiloé, and now the same white shadow accompanying me. Nitochka Nizvanova, Nevsky Avenue, wide, somnolent, a drowned choir and a lost violin. Ancient time, ancient white pain, terrible beings of another city who lived here, sordid torments, pale rows of fog and snow, Nitochka Nizvanova, senseless movement in the fog, in the snow, faltering sufferings, lives like wells, the soul, marsh of blind fish, the soul, lake of dormant alcohols, suddenly mad windows delirious at night, sonatas of a single string curling up in the devil's tail, crimes long told and retold. Honour the cold daybreak. The world changed. It is night. Clear, nocturnal solitude. Tomorrow the day will be populated with songs and burning faces of beings who sail in the ship of the new happiness, of hands banging the feverish workshops, of shirts amplifying the white light, of shared issues like the breads of gold, like through the unanimous following. That is it now. The lonely beings in the books arrive to accompany me. But solitude is not here. It doesn't exist. They burn in the corolla of life, live the organised dignity of labour, the ancient angst, separated their pages like a tree tilted by the wind, rejecting the storm now. The bronze horse, the night, are not about to start the journey. They return. The nearer is not going, it is arriving with news of gold. The syllables of silver. The ancient characters sheathed in fog have left, parading elevated hats of smoke. The women carved in snow, crying on a handkerchief on the river. They emigrated, fell from the books, and the crazed students, waiting axe in hand, at the old lady's door, ran. That world of frantic popes and laughter, dead in a cup, sleds, kidnapping innocents, blood and black wolves in the snow, all that fell from the books. It ran from the life like a bad dream. Now the cupolas slide the ring of the crescent moon, and again the clearest night sails near the city. They brought up the two heavy anchors to the great doors of the Admiralty. Leningrad sails, the shadows dispersed, cold frightened, when on the Winter Palace staircase history ascended with the people's feet. Later on war came to the city, war with its teeth, demolishing the ancient model of beauty, gluttonous, eating a cake of grey stone and snow and blood, war whistling amid the walls, taking men away, spying on children, war with its empty sack and terrible drum, war with broken glasses and death in bed, stiff under the cold, and the high valour, higher than a fir tree, round like grave cupolas, erected like serene columns, the grave resistance like symmetry of stone, courage like a living flame amid the snow, was indomitable bonfire. In Leningrad, the Soviet heart, and today everything lives and sleeps. The Leningrad night covers not only the palaces, the fenced iron gates, the platonic cornices, the ancient splendour, not only the engines and the countless new homes, life far and wide, the construction of the world, night clear shadows join the ancient night like the day, and the smell of water. Peter the Great and Lenin the Great became a unit. Time became a rose, the invincible tower. It smells like buried fire. unbreakable flower circulates on the street, the living, timeless blood. What was and what will be became one in the spacious rose, and the ship sails, it perfumes the grey tower of the north, wide and celestial, firm in its rain of snow, populated not by shadows, but by the grandeur of its blood, crowned by the marine rumour of history, shining with pride, prepared with all its beauty, like an arrogant salon for its people's gatherings. Quite passionate. Neruda's first contact with Russia came in, physical contact, came in 1949 when he was invited to Leningrad, that poem we just heard about that, to commemorate the 150th anniversary of Pushkin's birth. And the first time in 1949, and you'll see Ehrenburg, moving pictures of Ehrenburg, you'll see Mikhail Koltsov, who was the other Russian correspondent in covering the Spanish Civil War for Pravda. Koltsov, of course, was returned to Spain and was executed by Stalin. That was extraordinary. Ehrenburg survived, and have a remarkable here. So here is the 3-minute clip. So these are the memoirs. Highly recommend this. This is just called Memoirs. In Spanish, the original Spanish, it was called Confieso que he vivido. I confess I've lived. Well, I admit it, I lived. But this is by Souvenir Press. And just a very brief bit from his description of going to Russia in 1949. So I was there for an appointment with a poet dead over 100 years, Alexander Pushkin, author of imperishable legends and novels. This prince of poets of the people holds the heart of the great Soviet Union. What first impressed me in the USSR was the feeling of immensity it gives, of unity within that vast country's population, the movements of the birches on the plains, the huge forests so miraculously unspoiled, the great rivers, the horses running like waves across the wheat fields. I loved the Soviet land at first sight. I realised not only does it offer a moral lesson for every corner of the globe where human life exists, but I sensed too that an extraordinary flight would begin from this land of steppes which preserves so much natural purity. I was in the middle of a forest where thousands of peasants in traditional festive costumes were listening to Pushkin's poems. Everything hummed with life, men, leaves, vast stretches of land. And the new wheat was beginning to show its first signs of life. Nature seemed to form a triumphant union with man. Out of those poems of Pushkin's in the Mikhailovsky forest, the man who would fly to other planets must inevitably rise. So Neruda returned many of his Ehrenburg. That's actually a picture of Ehrenburg when he visited Neruda in 1954 for Neruda's 50th birthday. Neruda loved birthday parties. He was an extravagant, generous host. He blew a lot of his money on these things. There he is, there's Ehrenburg. And when Neruda once I have to say, Ehrenburg was a very good critic, as well as a translator. He criticised Neruda for using the word raíces too much, roots. And it's true, he did. As did Neruda's second wife, Delia El Carril. And the manuscripts of Delia saying, and the margin saying, you're using that word too often. and he did. Roots, if you read Neruda, it's full of raíces. It is. And once, he complained, he said to Neruda, too many roots, there are too many roots in your verses, why all these roots? And Pablo Neruda explained that Chile's trees had grown roots in his poetry. My life has been a long and difficult peregrination which has always led me back to the woods of southern Chile, the lost woods. By the way, Ilya Ehrenburg also nourished a passion for plants. He owned a dacha with a garden outside Moscow, and Pablo Neruda remembered in these memoirs, Ilya Ehrenburg spent a lot of time in his garden, always plucking out weeds. And then, as I say, he came over to Chile for Neruda's 50th birthday, and then when he died, Ehrenburg, in 1967, it was a huge shock. It was because Neruda was a very close friend of Ehrenburg. They shared these long train journeys. They were on the Trans-Siberian Express together on the way to China. How much, now this is a question which maybe we can talk about in the Q&A afterwards, How much did Ehrenburg know about what was going on? The gulags? I would think quite a lot. How much did he tell Neruda? That's a different question. How much was he willing to tell? He was a very clever man, Ehrenburg, to have survived. I mean, he was Jewish, and that wasn't necessarily a great thing to be at the time. By the way, Garry Kasparov, anyone who plays chess, Garry Kasparov's real name was Harry Weinstein, or Weinstein, which has a different, that Weinstein, it has a different word, different meaning today. But he told me, I interviewed Garry Kasparov, and he said he changed his name because it wasn't good to be Jewish. So, you know, but Ehrenburg survived. Anyway, when Neruda heard about his great friend's death, he made this moving comment. The years go by, we're used up, we become weak. Ever more often we have to say goodbye. The wind blew away the fragile person of E.A. Ehrenburg, my dear friend, the defender of truth. With his death I lost one of the men I have most admired and respected. He honoured me by counting me as his friend, and we worked and travelled together, sharing dreams and hopes that are still alive. This is Neruda with his third wife, Neruda in Moscow. Here are some of the friends, some of the Soviet friends, mostly writers. In the memoirs, he says, the poet Kirsanov, who translated my poetry into Russian so admirably, became a good friend of mine. Like all Soviet poets, Kirsanov is an ardent patriot. In his poetry there are brilliant flashes and the rich music of the beautiful Russian language, which his pen releases into the air in cascades. Now here is an extraordinary photo. This is left to right. Konstantin Simonov on the left. Roman Carmen, I don't know whether anyone, do anyone know the name?
No.
He was an incredibly important Soviet, born in Odessa, a Soviet cameraman and director, second to the left, Carmen. Neruda, of course, an unmistakable profile, second to the right, and another cameraman, and they were on the set of a film called, actually called Granada, My Granada is the real name. It's a film made in 1967, shot in Barcelona. The amazing thing about that film, that is, Neruda said he would never go back to Spain while Franco was alive. But he made some odd exceptions. He said, I'll go back to the ports. I mean, I'll go back to Barcelona, I'll go to Cadiz, I'll go to Canary Islands. That doesn't really count as proper Spain. And so he did. So he sneaked in clandestinely into Barcelona. He actually met Garcia Marquez at that point, who was living in Barcelona. And this is a photo of it's a wonderful photo. I don't know. I mean, I don't know much more about it. I've been trying to find more about this. I do know a lot about Carmen. He was extraordinary. He covered most, second from the left, Russian. He covered most of the conflicts of the Second World War. He covered the Spanish Civil War. He covered Indochina War. He covered the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets called it. He covered the siege of Leningrad. He was there to cover the siege of Leningrad. He had several wives. One of his wives left him for Vasily Stalin, the son of Stalin. I mean, I'm writing a piece on him for a film journal because people didn't deserve to know. He died in 1978. He just made a series of documentaries about the Soviet-Nazi conflict, which he never saw finished because he died in 1978. That was the date it was revealed. So he's a remarkable guy.
He was shooting newsreels.
Sorry.
Newsreels.
Yes, newsreel. He shot newsreel. Simonov. So, sorry, the other thing I should say, that Carmen was the first person to take pictures of Majdanek death camp in Poland, Lublin. He was there, and who did the news report? Konstantin Simonov. He published, so they were a team then, and they teamed up on this film because Simonov was the scriptwriter on Granada, My Granada. So, a wonderful little, there's a lot of big backstory to that photo, which I'm absolutely fascinated. Another of Neruda's translators, Lev Opavan. He would vote. He would. Yeah, sure, that's fine. He recalled Neruda as a man with a great sense of humour and affection for his friends. At one Moscow party, Neruda rose to his feet and said, "Here among us sits our friend Lev, who wrote a whole book about me. They say it's not a bad book. I've no idea because I haven't been able to read it for obvious reasons." He didn't read Russian. He didn't learn any Russian. By the way, his great friend Paul Robeson did learn Russian. Worth remembering. Neruda never learned Russian. So anyway, he said, "I haven't been able to read it for obvious reasons. So I raised my glass," said Neruda. "May all my books come out in languages I don't understand." Kasparov shared his department with Moscow apartment with another translator of Neruda's poetry, Vera Utisikova, and I was very lucky enough to interview her in Moscow. She told me once she never saw Neruda get angry or even flustered. On one occasion, when he visited their apartment, Neruda was greeted by an old floor polisher who delighted him by reciting Neruda's poetry by heart. By the way, that's something Neruda couldn't do himself. He could never remember. He's one of those poets who could never remember his own poetry, but he could remember French poetry. He could recite Verlaine, Rimbaud, Baudelaire by heart, and he couldn't recite his own poetry. I write poetry. I know how hard it is to remember your own poetry. I write poetry. I can't remember my own poetry, but I think it's a part of the brain. Just to go on a diversion. Yeah.
Those dates is 1992.
Sorry?
Was 1992.
Well, that can't be right. That's a misprint, isn't it? Should be 19. Yeah, that's his birthday. He was very. Yeah, that can't be right. He can't have lived. He was very short-lived.
He was very short-lived.
Yes. 2009 is the day when he definitely the year when he died. But I don't think he was only what's that? 11 years. He's very well preserved, isn't he? Yes. Anyway, they were well spotted. Well spotted, Carolina. Sharp like Venezuelan eyes there. So yeah, well, I was going on a tangent saying that. I mean, I can sight read any piece of music, but I can't remember. I don't know how concert pianists can remember all of Beethoven's sonatas by heart, and all poets can remember hard sound. It's a different part of the brain. Anyway, right, another great film, Margarita Renegade. Soviet poet. I've got the dates right this time. You got me worried now. And I'm going to read a lovely little bit that Neruda wrote about her visit to Chile from Fashions and Impressions. Yeah, I was in Concepcion in the south of my country when I read in the newspapers that Margarita Alegría had arrived in Chile. It was midsummer in Chile. The sky of the south was wholly blue, like a blue banner, like a goblet. Not the tiniest white cloud. The blue sky of Chile needed Margarita Alegría because she is like a little white cloud. She's so silent, as if she were travelling enveloped in a cloud. Moreover, she often sits on the little cloud, and after a gathering, it gently transports her wherever she wants to go. And it goes on. But the fragile figure of Margarita, with its ethereal gentleness, vibrated among the phosphorescent plains of the fresco to take its place among the monumental subterranean figures as it had been painted there. My mother, Elaine Feinstein, who is a writer and a biographer of Tsvetaeva and Akhmatova, so she's a Russianist, she knew Margarita Alegría very well and said she was a lovely woman, very, very fragile. That's the word she used, Elaine. She still uses it. Very fragile, yeah, but a wonderful, sensitive human being.
22 is the date of birth of Lev Kasparov.
Sorry?
22. Lev Kasparov was born at
right, thank you. I'll correct that. Now, so Neruda was fascinated by the space race. Of course, he was very proud of the fact that the first person into space was not an American but a Russian, Gagarin, and this is the first woman in space, of course. And the first woman in space. Neruda met the cosmonaut of Vostok 2, describing him as a kind young man with large shiny eyes. According to his autobiography, Pablo Neruda asked German Titov, "Commander, did you see Chile when you were flying through space, looking down on our planet?" And German Titov answered, "The most important thing was to have seen Chile from above. Do you understand? I saw yellow mountains in South America. They seemed to me very high. Maybe that was Chile." Neruda said, "Of course it was Chile." And he mentions Valentina in a book called Comiendo en Hungría, Eating in Hungary, which he co-wrote with Miguel Ángel Asturias, and he never failed to bring in his love of the heroism he saw of the Soviet government. This is a fascinating guy. Anyone know who this is? He was Latvian. He moved to Chile. Became a Chilean. He was a doctor and a scientist. Terrible picture. I don't know why it's out of focus, but anyway, became a great friend of Neruda's. Was very interested in indigenous native Chileans, and there's a wonderful anecdote that Neruda told of. There was a party once in Santiago, and Arcadio Cotapos, who was Neruda's great composer friend, started talking to him in what appeared to be Russian. And Lipschutz, after we just founded him, he said he couldn't understand a word Cotapos was saying. So it went on for about 5 minutes, and then Lipschutz went over to Neruda and said, "Pablo, I've lived so far long out of my country, I can't understand Russian anymore." Neruda said, "Are you kidding? Cotapos doesn't speak Russian, that was completely invented. He wasn't speaking Russian, he was just inventing a language." So poor Lipschutz was being gobbledygook, and he thought he'd forgotten his language. It was a very sad story. Now, some of the I'm going to have to mention some of the shameful incidents in Neruda's life. This is Paris Pasternak. This was shameful. I'm going to read a tiny bit from my own biography now about what happened. I met Pasternak's son, Yevgeny, and I asked him, "Do you consider that your father was a friend of Neruda?" And he went very quiet, tellingly quiet, and turned away. And I'll explain why they weren't friends. I'll read from this, and I think it will become clear. Does anyone know the story of Neruda and Pasternak? Doesn't reflect very well on Neruda at all, I have to say. Anyway, Neruda, this is from my biography. Neruda was delighted when Boris Pasternak was awarded the 1958 Nobel Prize for Literature. According to Jorge Edwards, who was a friend of Neruda, Neruda welcomed the decision as marking the end of the isolation of Soviet literature. A few days later, however, he heard that the Kremlin had banned publication of Pasternak's novel, Dr. Zhivago, and had prevented him from travelling to Stockholm to receive the prize. Neruda, writes Edwards, could have protested, without a doubt, but that protest would have provoked a considerable political scandal and would have served, as they put it at the time, to lend ammunition to the enemy's arguments. So he opted for swallowing his initial enthusiasm and maintaining a strict, uncomfortable silence. As I go on to say, it is very difficult to admire this silence. Neruda shrewdly realised the importance of playing the Cold War game of offering no ammunition to his right-wing opponents. Still, his mute acceptance of the Soviet mistreatment of Pasternak leaves a sour taste in the mouth. And it does. And it still does to me today. And there's no doubt that when Yevgeny Pasternak walked away from me, when I mentioned Neruda's name, I think, he still blamed Neruda for that silence. On the other hand, he was willing in private to condemn what the Russians were doing. He wouldn't do it in public because, as he said, that would give ammunition. But Joseph Brodsky, of course, was a great poet who went into exile in the States. And Vera Kuteshikova, one of the Russian translators I already mentioned, told me this when I talked to her in Moscow. In private, he had serious misgivings. He said, his Russian friend Vera Kuteshikova told me that during one of his visits to Moscow, he asked her, how can they persecute a great poet like Joseph Brodsky? Brodsky had been tried in 1963 on charges of social parasitism. He'd written poetry without being a member of the Soviet Writers' Union and sentenced to 5 years hard labour in Archangels in northern Russia, although a campaign successfully secured his relief after 18 months. Significantly, Neruda never voiced his protest publicly, just as he never publicly protested over the treatment of Boris Pasternak in 1958. His refusal to stand up and condemn the persecution of his Soviet colleagues, while understandable given his emotional attachment to the party, must still be deplored. So, but in private he did. Two more writers who were victims of Soviet repression, Sinyavsky and Daniel. They wrote under their pseudonyms, respectively, of Avram Terz and Nikolai Arzak. They were two young Soviet writers who were sent to labour camps in February 1966, and for smuggling they worked out to the west. And in June 1966, Neruda took part in the Pen Club meeting in New York, historic meeting, and he refused to talk about this case when he was asked. He said, well, he hummed and hawed and said, "I've seen repression on both sides of the Iron Curtain," which is not much of an answer, really, let's face it. Because at the same time he was criticising writers like Steinbeck and Hemingway for not condemning the Americans in the Korean War or the Vietnam War. So a lot of people were saying, Pablo Neruda, double standards. Yeah, possibly. Well, definitely, I think. So let me address the, before I move on, address the issue of Neruda's Stalinism head on. He was, of course, as I said, quick to condemn American writers for their silence in the face of Korean and Vietnam wars. But, as the Brodsky case I just cited indicate, in private he did have misgivings. When I interviewed Arthur Miller, the great playwright, who had got Neruda into New York in 1966, past the communist bloc, he expressed astonishment that such an intelligent, sensitive man as Pablo Neruda could cling on so long to Stalinism. But I have no doubt that Neruda was badly shaken by the events of 1956, first of all, with the Khrushchev, the revelations, and the invasion of Hungary, of course, and then the Khrushchev revelations in 20th Communist Party. And 2 years later, in fact, 1958, he published one of my favourite of all his books, Stavagalio, which is full of doubt, self-doubt, wondering, unsure of himself. And I think that's definitely a mark of his reaction to what was happening in the Soviet bloc. And then, of course, in 1968 came the crushing of the Prague Spring, and Neruda actually wrote a poem that saying that this event fell on his head like a heavy stone. He actually used that word. It really was a huge shock, the invasion of the crushing of the liberation movement in Prague in 1968. He also became extremely disenchanted by the cult of personality of Stalin and of Mao in China, where he visited several times. In fact, Mao first got him, all the statues of Mao and all the stations and along the train journey. He thought, what's that about? He really felt that was ridiculous. And then he extrapolated that onto Stalin statues. So he was weakening much more than people think. And he told a French journalist in 1971, on s'est trompé, we were wrong. You can't get more clear than that. Let me just go forward. So he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1971, and while serving as Chile's ambassador in Paris. In the early 1970s he travelled to Moscow on several occasions to receive treatment for his cancer. As we know, a team of forensic scientists who examined Neruda's remains after they exhumed him in 2013 just announced that cancer could not be the official cause of death. Their reasoning is that to have cancer, he would have had to have lost a lot of weight. Where in fact when he died, he was obese. That's their official. I'm not a forensic scientist. I'm not a medical man.